Jae-won Park had 11 days left before the bank took the last 40 acres of his dairy farm. 3 counties away, a lawyer was already dialing his number about a dead man's will. Nobody in Larkin, Wisconsin, had ever mentioned to him. Every morning at 4:40, before the sky over the tree line turned the color of skim milk, Misuk Park hung a string of small brass bells on the kitchen window latch. They had belonged to her grandmother's wedding chest in Daegu, carried across an ocean, in a suitcase wrapped twice in wool blankets, and the thin, uneven sound they made in the wind was the only thing in Wisconsin that still sounded like home. She boiled water for barley tea while Jae-won pulled on his boots in the mudroom, the same boots he'd worn for 11 years, resoled twice since they had sunk their savings and a small business loan. Almost nobody wanted to give a Korean couple with no farming pedigree into 90 acres of failing dairy operation on County Road W. 11 years earlier, they had lost a restaurant in Milwaukee to an electrical fire that started in a neighboring unit at 2 in the morning and took 18 months of their lives with it. They had lost their older son's college fund, trying to reopen it somewhere smaller, before finally accepting that the restaurant was gone for good. What they had left by the time they found the Larkin listing at a fraction of its assessed value was $40,000, 2 teenage sons who no longer wanted to talk about Milwaukee, and a stubborn belief that land, unlike a lease or a business partner, could not simply walk away from you in the night. The previous owner, a man named Gerald Kowalczyk, had let the herd dwindle from 90 head to 12 before he finally sold, and had let the barn roof rust through in 3 places rather than pay for repairs. The town of Larkin had loved Gerald anyway, the way small towns love a familiar failure, more easily than an unfamiliar success. 11 years in, the town still hadn't quite decided whether to love the Parks. Their 2 sons had grown up mostly in Larkin now, more Wisconsin than Daegu in their vowels, embarrassed in the particular way of teenagers by their mother's bells, her barley tea, the kimchi jars fermenting quietly in the mudroom beside the boots and coveralls. They came home from the county school most afternoons, smelling faintly of a world their parents had built for them at enormous cost, a world neither boy fully understood the price of yet, and probably wouldn't until they were parents themselves. On a nail by the back door hung a cast-iron dinner bell, pitted green with age that had come with the property, and predated even Gerald's ownership. Misuk had never rung it. It was heavy, its clapper stiff with 40 years of rust, but she kept it polished anyway, wiping it down every few weeks the way you keep a promise you haven't yet found a reason to fulfill. That morning, hanging her grandmother's bells in the cold, she didn't know that within 2 weeks the old iron bell would ring for the first time in 4 decades, or that when it finally did, the entire quiet war over 8 feet of gravel road and one old neighbor's refusal to ever discuss it would suddenly make painful, complete sense. The 8 feet of gravel were the only legal access from County Road W to the park's north pasture, and they belonged on paper and in stubborn fact to a man named Walter Voss. Jae-won had asked politely the first year they moved in, standing in Walter's driveway with his hat in his hands. Walter had said no without offering a reason and closed his truck door before Jae-won finished the sentence. He'd asked again in year 3, this time with an offer, $4,000 for a permanent easement, more than fair for 8 feet of gravel nobody else used. Walter had said no again, not bothering to roll his window down more than a crack. By year 7, Jae-won had stopped asking altogether and had instead built a longer, rutted detour around the property line that added 40 extra minutes to every trip during calving season, and that had twice swallowed his truck axle deep in March mud with a full trailer of feed hitched behind it. The detour had a name in Jae-won's head that he never said aloud in front of Misuk, the long way. He had learned every rut, every soft shoulder, every place where spring runoff turned the low ground to soup, the way a man learns the scars on his own hands. He had learned to leave 40 extra minutes earlier than any of the other farmers on the route, to plan calving season and harvest season around a detour that existed only because one neighbor, for reasons never explained, would not sell him 8 feet of gravel that had sat unused under Wisconsin sky since before either of them had bought their land. This year, the detour itself wasn't the problem. The county was. A long overdue drainage project on County Road W meant the paved route the Parks relied on would be closed entirely. 11 days, the notice said, starting the following Monday, for regrading and repaving before the frost came back. 11 days with no way to get his milk tank truck to the co-op pickup point, except straight across those 8 feet of Walter Voss's gravel. 11 days, and his loan officer at First Farmers Bank, a tired man named Denny Ostrowski, who had inherited the Parks file from a retired colleague, had already told him flatly on the phone that 2 missed milk pickups in a row would trigger an automatic review of the farm's operating line of credit. The same line of credit that was the only thing standing between the Parks and losing the north 40 acres outright to the bank. Misuk found her husband at the kitchen table that night with the bank letter and the county notice laid side by side, doing the same grim arithmetic 3 separate times and arriving at the same number each time. "We ask him again," she said, not quite a question. "I've asked him 6 times in 11 years, Jae-won said, not looking up. "Offered him $4,000 once. He wouldn't even discuss a number. He's not selling us 8 feet of anything, Misuk. He never has." "Then we ask a different question," she said. "Not to buy it, just to understand why." Jae-won called the loan officer back the next morning anyway, more out of habit than hope. Denny Ostrowski was not unkind, exactly, just tired in the specific way of a man who had inherited 40 farm files from a retired colleague and no patience left over for any of them. 11 days, Jae-won, he said. 2 missed pickups, and I have to flag the file for review. That's not me being difficult. That's just how the software works now. Jae-won thanked him anyway, the way he had learned to thank people who had just told him something he didn't want to hear, and hung up the phone feeling the particular exhaustion of a man solving a math problem with only bad numbers to work with. Outside, the wind picked up sharply, and her grandmother's brass bells rang once against the window glass. Sudden, clear, almost deliberate, like something trying very hard to get their attention, before it was too late to matter. Neither of them yet knew that a letter had already been mailed from a law office in Green Bay, addressed to Jae-won by name, that would arrive within 4 days and explain, in the dry language of an estate attorney, exactly why that gravel strip mattered so much more than either of them had ever imagined. Walter Voss was 81 years old, and as far as the town of Larkin was concerned, he had been a difficult old man for exactly as long as anyone could remember. He lived alone on the 110 acres bordering the park's property, kept no livestock, farmed nothing beyond a small vegetable patch, and mowed 1 fenced quarter-acre behind his house with an obsessive, almost ceremonial regularity that most of his neighbors filed away alongside his refusal to ever sell that useless-looking strip of gravel road. Jae-won drove to Walter's porch that Tuesday morning with the county's closure notice in hand, and for the first time in over a decade, no offer of money folded into his shirt pocket. He simply explained the situation as plainly as he could. 11 days of road closure, the milk tank truck, the bank's ultimatum sitting on his kitchen table. Walter listened from behind the screen door without opening it, said only, "That's not my problem, Mr. Park," and shut the inner door before Jae-won had finished his last sentence. At the co-op that Thursday morning, waiting his turn at the feed counter, Jae-won mentioned the standoff to Hank Dietrich, who had farmed 2 miles down the same county road for going on 30 years and had never once said an unkind word to either of the Parks. Hank's face did something complicated. A flicker of discomfort, quickly smoothed over. "You know why he won't sell you that strip," Hank said. "It wasn't offered as a question. He's never told me anything. 11 years, and not once." "Then it's not really mine to tell," Hank said, turning back to stacking feed bags with more concentration than the task required, leaving Jae-won standing there with the distinct and unsettling sense that everyone in Larkin, Wisconsin, knew something about Walter Voss that he did not, and that they had all agreed, without ever discussing it, not to say it aloud in front of him. He tried once more at the hardware store on Main Street, where the owner's wife, a heavy-set woman named Carol, who had sold the Parks their first set of fence posts 11 years earlier, only shook her head when he brought up Walter's name. "That's an old wound, Jae-won," she said, not unkindly, sliding a box of fence staples across the counter without being asked the way she did every spring. "Older than you and Gerald and this whole farm put together. Some things in a small town, you just learn to walk around instead of asking straight out. My own mother knew Walter's wife back before she left. Said the woman never smiled again after 87, not once, not even at her own sister's wedding the year after. It was the closest anyone had come to explaining anything at all, and it told him almost nothing except that whatever it was old, and it was a wound, and it had nothing to do with him. That Friday, a certified letter arrived at the farmhouse from Halverson and Reyes, attorneys at law out of Green Bay. It was addressed specifically to Jae-won Park, regarding the estate of a man named Kowalczyk. Not Gerald, the man who had sold them the farm, but Gerald's great-uncle, Anton Kowalczyk, who had died the previous winter at the age of 94 with no children of his own. The letter explained, in the flat, careful language particular to estate law, that Anton had left behind a conditional bequest tied directly to the original 1961 boundary lines of the farm, a bequest that could not be processed, settled, or released to any party until the long-standing question of shared access between the Park and Voss properties was formally and legally resolved. He thought, at first, that it might be some kind of mistake, a clerical error, a case of a lawyer's office, confusing one Kowalczyk file for another. Gerald had never once mentioned an uncle in 11 years of occasional small talk at the co-op, never mentioned Green Bay, never mentioned any family beyond the wife who'd left with him for Arizona the year after the sale closed. But the letter had the farm's parcel number typed correctly, the boundary survey date correctly, even the name of the county surveyor who'd walked the property line with Jae-won back in his first month of ownership. Whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. Jae-won read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, slowly, as though rereading it might change what it said. My-suk read it twice more over his shoulder, one hand resting lightly on his back. "There is money," she said finally, slowly, "attached to our land, and it is stuck, held up, because of Walter's road." Neither of them yet knew how much money or why a dead man's estate would care, decades later, about 8 feet of gravel between 2 struggling dairy farms. The letter didn't say. It said only that a representative of the firm would call within the week, and that until the access dispute was resolved, nothing else in the estate could move forward at all. Misa called Priya Reyes's office herself that same afternoon, while Jae-won was still out checking fence line, and asked the one question the letter hadn't answered. Why would a man's estate, settled decades after a land sale, still care about a road nobody but two farmers ever used? Priya's assistant could only say that the trust language was unusually specific, almost personal, in a way she rarely saw in the state paperwork, and that Ms. Reyes would explain further once the access question was resolved. It was not an answer. It was, Misuk thought, hanging up the phone, the shape of an answer, something with weight and edges, even if she couldn't yet see what it was. For the first time in 11 years, Jae-won found himself wanting, urgently, to understand Walter Voss, rather than simply outlast him. But what neither he nor Misuk knew yet, what no lawyer's letter, no bank statement, and no amount of patient waiting could have told them, was that the real reason Walter Voss would never sell, lease, or even discuss that strip of gravel had nothing at all to do with money, or spite, or the ordinary stubbornness of an old man set in his ways. The lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Reyes, called on Tuesday afternoon and confirmed exactly what the letter had implied. Anton Kowalczyk had left behind a conditional trust worth $63,000, earmarked specifically for restoring the original farm access route that had existed on the property since 1961. The same 8 feet of gravel, currently sitting quietly and immovably under Walter Voss's name. Anton, it turned out, had been the one who sold that narrow strip to Walter's father back in 1979 for reasons the letter didn't specify, and had apparently spent close to 4 decades quietly regretting the sale. $63,000 would clear the park's operating line of credit twice over, with enough left to repair the barn roof Gerald Kowalczyk had never bothered to fix. It would also require Walter Voss's signature on paperwork he had declined to sign for 11 straight years, for reasons that, until that Tuesday afternoon, no one in Larkin had ever fully explained to Jae-won at all. He decided to try Walter one final time, not with an offer this time, but with a single honest question. He found the old man on his fenced quarter-acre behind the house, on his knees in the grass with a pair of pruning shears, trimming with great care around something Jae-won had never once gotten close enough to see clearly in 11 years of driving past that fence. Up close now, through a gap between 2 slats, it was a small granite marker, weathered soft at its edges, half sunk into the earth beneath a low tangle of wild asters. Daniel Walter Voss, 1968-1987. Beloved son. He was 19, Walter said, without turning around before Jae-won had managed to say a single word. Grain auger took his arm before anyone got out to him in time. He bled out in the field behind where your north pasture starts now, about 40 yards past that gravel strip you've been asking me about for 11 years. Jae-won stood very still, his hat forgotten in his hands. That road, Walter went on, quieter now, is the last piece of ground my boy ever walked across on his own 2 feet. Everybody in this town knows what happened out there, Mr. Park. Nobody talks about it because nobody knows what to say to an old man whose only child has been in the ground for 39 years. So instead, they just say, "I'm difficult." It's easier than saying the truth out loud. "I didn't know," Jae-won said quietly. "I would never have asked you all these years if I had known." "You asked because you needed a road for your milk truck," Walter said. "That's not a crime, Mr. Park. But I've had lawyers, neighbors, and 2 different county surveyors try to buy that strip off me since 1988. Every single one of them wanted to grade it flat, gravel it wider, run heavier trucks over it than it was ever built to hold. I wasn't going to let strangers pave over the last place my son ever stood." Walter set down his shears and sat back on his heels in the grass, looking at the stone rather than at Jae-won. His mother left 2 years after, he said, almost as an afterthought, the way a man mentions a scar he stopped noticing decades ago. Couldn't stay in a house where every window looked out at the field where it happened. I understood it. I just couldn't do it myself. Somebody had to stay and keep the grass cut. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved low through the fenced grass, and somewhere behind Jae-won, impossibly far from the farmhouse, he thought, just for a second, that he heard his wife's brass bells. He almost turned and walked away without mentioning the trust at all. The $63,000, the lawyer's paperwork waiting on his kitchen table. It felt suddenly, deeply obscene to have come here armed with numbers. I don't need to widen anything, he finally said. I don't need to grade it, or gravel it any different than it's always been. I just need to drive a milk truck across it, gently, for 11 days a year, the way you'd walk past a place you loved. Walter looked up at him then, for the first time in 11 years, really looked at him. Everybody who's ever asked before wanted to change it, he said. You're the first one who's ever asked to leave it exactly the way it is. He didn't say yes that afternoon. He only nodded once, stiffly, and went back to trimming around the stone, and Jae-won understood well enough to leave without pushing further. Driving home along the long way one final time, past the soft shoulder that had swallowed his truck axle twice, he found he no longer felt the old resentment he'd carried for 11 years toward that stretch of mud. It was hard to be angry at a detour built around a boy's grave, once you knew that's what it was. That night, he told Mi-suk everything, sitting at the same kitchen table, where the bank letter and the county notice still lay side by side, and for once, neither of them mentioned money at all. They didn't sign anything that week. Instead, Jae-won asked Walter one more question. A few days later, sitting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, Mi-suk had sent over in a battered thermos, whether Walter had ever let himself imagine what he might want that strip of ground to become, if he ever let it go. It took 3 more conversations, spread out over 2 slow weeks, before Walter finally said what he had apparently been carrying alone since 1987. He didn't want the ground to simply disappear into someone else's driveway, worn smooth by a decade of tires. He wanted it marked, remembered, visited by more than one lonely old man with a pair of shears once a week for the rest of his own life. Priya Reyes drove out from Green Bay herself for the final meeting, at Walter's request, and sat at the Park's kitchen table with the trust paperwork spread out beside Mi-suk's teapot. She explained finally what neither Jae-won nor Mi-suk had been able to piece together on their own. Anton Kowalczyk had been at the wheel of the delivery truck that struck the grain auger's power line the morning of the accident in 1987. A mechanical failure, nobody's fault by any legal measure, but one Anton had carried like a debt for the rest of his life anyway. Selling that strip of his own land to Walter's father 2 years later, cheap, almost as a penance, had been the closest he ever came to making amends. The trust was his last attempt, decades late, to finish something he'd never had the courage to finish while he was alive. So the agreement they eventually signed at Priya Reyes's small office in Green Bay wasn't a simple easement after all. It was smaller than that, and somehow much larger. Walter granted the Parks a permanent right-of-way exactly as wide as the existing gravel, and not 1 foot wider, on the single condition that a modest fenced plot, 4 feet by 6, be established permanently at its edge, planted with the same wild asters that already grew there, with Daniel's granite marker moved from behind Walter's house to a spot where the morning sun would reach it first, before it reached anything else on either farm. The trust money went toward that small memorial, toward the road's long-overdue drainage repair, and toward clearing the rest of the park's operating loan in full. The county's own road crew, as it turned out, finished the drainage work 2 days ahead of schedule, and by the following Monday, the paved route on County Road W was open again in full. But by then, the gravel strip through Walter's land had already stopped being an emergency measure and become something else entirely. The first 8 feet of a friendship neither man had expected, and the last 8 feet of a boy's life that had finally, after 39 years, been allowed to matter out loud to more than one grieving old man. On the morning the easement paperwork was formally recorded at the county courthouse, Jae-won drove his milk tank truck across the 8 feet of gravel for the first time in his life without asking anyone's permission, past a small stone marker with fresh purple asters planted at its base, and past Walter Voss himself, standing quietly at the fence line with his hat off. That evening, Mi-suk carried the old cast-iron dinner bell out from beside the back door for the first time since they'd bought the farm, the one she had polished for 11 years without ever finding a reason to ring. She rang it once, the way she imagined the farm's very first family might have rung it home for supper, generations before any of them, Kowalczyks, Vosses, or Parks, had ever set foot on this particular stretch of Wisconsin soil. The sound carried low and heavy across both properties, past the fence line, past the new asters, past a boy who had been gone for 39 years, and past a road that had finally, after 4 decades, been allowed to stay exactly what it had always quietly been. Walter came for supper that night, and the first time, by his own admission, that he'd sat at another family's table since 1987. Mi-suk made a pot of doenjang jjigae without asking whether he'd like it, the way she'd have fed any neighbor, and Walter ate 2 bowls of it slowly, saying very little, while Min-ho and his older brother argued over something on a phone screen at the far end of the table like the ordinary teenagers they mostly were. It was, Jae-won thought, watching Walter watch his sons bicker. Probably the first noisy family dinner the old man had sat through in nearly 4 decades. And he wondered, not unkindly, whether that alone might be worth more to him than the $63,000 now sitting in the park's cleared bank account. Walter didn't say very much over the meal itself, but when Mi-suk hung her grandmother's brass bells back on the kitchen window latch afterward, he stood by the door for a long moment and listened to them catch the evening wind, the way a man listens to something he half recognizes from somewhere very far away. The town of Larkin never did formally apologize for 20 years of quietly assuming the Parks had simply let a good farm run down out of neglect or ignorance, the way outsiders sometimes do in places that don't know them yet. They didn't need to. By the following spring, half the county had heard the real story. The boy in the north pasture, the gravel road no one had ever explained, and the Korean immigrant couple who had finally asked to leave a piece of ground exactly as it was instead of trying to change it to suit themselves. Walter still mows the small fenced plot himself every week, though these days Jae-won drives the truck across the gravel first and slows down without being asked, the way you slow down for anything worth respecting. Some mornings, if the wind is right, Mi-suk says she can hear her grandmother's bells all the way from the kitchen window out past the fence line, mixing with the low iron note of the old dinner bell. She rings now most evenings just to call her sons home for supper, 2 sounds from 2 very different worlds, carried across the same 8 feet of ground that had waited 39 years for someone to finally ask the right question instead of the easy one. That, more than any yield report or cleared loan, was what finally made Larkin, Wisconsin, start to feel, quietly and for good, like home.